Okay, so going over the factory manual recommendations for disassembly and assembly of the rear wheel are: disassemble and assemble the rear wheel according to the illustration. Install each dust seal with the flat side facing out so that it is flush with the hub and driven flange end surfaces. Install the brake disc with the rotation mark arrow facing out. Use only the specified tire and driven sprocket to avoid malfunctions of the IMU and ABS. So we'll look at the illustration here and go through the components. So the factory manual doesn't get too specific about how to take these things apart. It really just tells you there's 4 bolts holding on the brake rotor, there's dust seal, there's a bearing, there's a distance collar, another bearing, an O-ring, and rubber dampers that go inside the driven hub, and another bearing, dust seal, and a sprocket, of course. So this system is kind of unique to where there's 2 dust seals, but there's 3 bearings and a spacer collar inside of the driven hub. The driven hub is kind of a floating mechanism with the rubber dampers inside this hub. It's pretty unique, and I think it's to avoid shock. It's to absorb shock from the drive chain to make a smoother ride. So I avoided the bearing replacement altogether, basically because I didn't have the special tools, and because I was short on time, and also because my powder coater / mechanic already knew how to do it. So I won't be covering that in this video. So we're taking the rear brake rotor off of the rear wheel assembly here, and this is just some Allen keys here, and they're on there pretty good, so I'm just using my leverage method of using a cheater bar with a wrench for this. Now we flip the wheel over to get to the rear sprocket, and you're looking at 14mm bolts that hold this rear sprocket on. So just go ahead and loosen those up. And we see underneath the sprocket there's a sub-assembly that's type of a floating, rubberized, shock-absorbing mount here. So we're going to go ahead and just slide that up, and you see it's a ribbed wheel, and underneath it are rubberized isolators, and underneath that is this important cone spacer. So take these rubber isolators out. It's worth noting that before you put your brake rotor on, you're going to want to make sure your dust seal is back in. And I was not able to highlight the procedure of removing and reinstalling the bearings in here. I had these wheels powder coated, and the person who powder coated them is also a custom motorcycle builder, so with that he removed the bearings during the process of powder coating. But the process involves a special tool specified in the manual. I didn't have that tool, nor did I want to go buy that tool for this job, so I left it to the motorcycle mechanic who was powder coating and swapping the tires for me to do that. His process was to basically get a punch or a drift pin in here and tap down the spacer that bridges these 2 bearing faces, and just tap out the bearing in that manner. That is not the correct way to do it, but it is the common practice because not too many people want to go out and buy an expensive slide hammer for that. So basically, the manual will tell you to replace these bearings whenever you remove them, and that's probably because there's force being put on the inside of the bearing and not on the outer race to where it's solid. So the good advice by the factory to tell you to replace the bearings, but not something that a lot of people are going to do logically. So we're going to go ahead and get this seal in here, and I'm basically not able to get it in by my fingers, so I'm just going to tap it in using a washer and the spacer from the front wheel. So the brake rotor is pretty cut and dry. Essentially, you're going to want to make sure it's facing outward, oriented correctly. There's an arrow that dictates rotation, but you're not going to get that wrong because it's only on one side. And you just slide it, line it up with the holes, and take your 4 Allen headed bolts here, get them threaded in, and then I'm gonna clock it just a slight bit just to make sure the bolts are going in flush. It's worth noting that when you tighten these, just observe a spiral pattern, a back and forth, because you're tightening a disc onto provisions here, and if you tighten one side unevenly, it could potentially warp the disc, but I see that as highly unlikely. And my little cheat here to get some torque on these with the Allen key is to just put a nut driver handle on them. I believe the torque spec on these is 20 foot-pounds, but I don't have a ratchet enabled Allen key, so I'm just gonna do my best feel of what 20 foot-pounds of torque would be. And it's probably even a good idea to just throw a dab of Loctite in there as well. So the first thing you're going to want to do as far as reassembly goes here is to get these rubber isolators back into place, and they just straddle the webbing on the inside of this wheel hub, and just make sure your cone spacer is in there. It'll stick into that bearing on this here. Let it drop in, and you can get your drive hub fitted inside those rubber isolators, and it'll stick in there pretty good. And I'm doing a sprocket change with this wheel swap out, so we're going to go ahead and fit this aftermarket sprocket on here now. And putting it back on, it's relatively simple. It's not going to go on backwards because it has the bevels in it, as you can see. If you put it on backwards, you definitely know. So essentially you just slide it on and then thread in your bolts. And these are going to be a little bit difficult to torque down on the bike, or while not on the bike, because of this drive hub assembly not being kind of permanently attached here. It's not loose, but if you were to put a lot of torque on it, it would probably pop it out. So we'll final tighten these on the bike, and I'll just preliminarily tighten them here. Just going to snug these up. We'll check the torque spec, and we'll see if we can get somewhere close to that before we install it back on the bike. So the manual states that it's 24 foot-pounds for the torque on this rear sprocket. So I'm gonna see what it takes to do that, but I also don't want to pop this off. So we'll see if we can't get it somewhat close. And then you can see the whole assembly rotating, and that's those rubber isolators that are in there. So I'm not even sure if I'm gonna try to do this without it being on the bike, because I just don't want the whole thing to fly off. So it's not really worth it to me in that opinion. So we have this on, we have it mounted. The next step now is to put it on the bike.